"I can prove it," said the maid's son. That night, in front of millionaires and experts, no one imagined that a humble boy's truth would crush the pride of a powerful man. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories that impact lives. The auditorium of the prestigious elite school was packed, illuminated by spotlights that gave a spectacle-like air to the most anticipated competition of the year, the Technological Inventions Fair. Students dressed in impeccable uniforms proudly walked alongside their futuristic prototypes, each vying for the attention of the judges and investors. Among them, renowned millionaire Charles Wentworth walked as if he owned the place, greeting only those he deemed important and ignoring any employee who crossed his path. For him, this was no mere student competition, but a showcase to display his fortune and feed his vanity before an influential audience. As parents and teachers took their seats in the audience, a nearly invisible figure went unnoticed. Luciana, the school janitor, discreetly pushed her cleaning cart. Her eyes were always lowered, accustomed to not being noticed, but her heart was restless. Beside her walked Raphael, her 13-year-old son, carrying a worn notebook filled with robot drawings, notes, and calculations that he treasured. The boy observed each invention with a gleam in his eye, as if this were his secret world finally before him, even though he knew he had no right to be there. Suddenly, the spotlight turned to the main stage, where the first team of students was presenting a sophisticated humanoid robot. The audience applauded enthusiastically, and Charles, seated in the front row, smiled in approval, as if he were the one responsible for the spectacle. Raphael, however, didn't blink at the scene, absorbing every detail as if memorizing a secret. At that moment, no one imagined that the maid's son, the boy who was only there because he insisted on accompanying his mother to work, would become the centerpiece of the evening. A performance capable of changing the course of the entire competition and exposing a truth that would crush the millionaire's pride before everyone. The atmosphere inside the auditorium was one of pure anticipation. Each presentation seemed bolder than the last, featuring machines that flashed lights, turned complex gears, or even responded to voice commands. The judges watched intently, taking detailed notes on their tablets, while the audience reacted with applause and murmurs of admiration. However, behind this facade of order and elegance, a silent tension loomed, the imposing presence of Charles Wentworth. Sitting in the front row, with his tailored suit and a watch that shone brighter than many of the projects on display, the millionaire made a point of demonstrating that he was there not only to sponsor, but to reaffirm his authority. He crossed his legs arrogantly, cast disdainful glances at less favored competitors, and smiled only when he realized his opinion mattered more than that of the experts. Raphael, seated discreetly in a side corner next to his mother, couldn't take his eyes off the stage, fascinated by every detail of the inventions. His heart was beating fast, as if he were silently participating in that competition to which he had never been invited. Luciana, on the other hand, looked nervously at her son. She knew Raphael was different, that from a young age he demonstrated an unusual intelligence for handling wires, gears, and circuits, but she also knew how much life had taught him to keep quiet. Children of maids had no place in places like that, much less a voice to express their opinions in competitions that brought together the city's wealthiest heirs. Still, the gleam in Raphael's eyes betrayed a desire she couldn't contain. He scribbled in his notebook whenever a team presented something new, drawing parts, adjusting calculations, as if trying to mentally solve the problems no one noticed. Luciana felt both pride and fear. Pride in seeing her son's passion, and fear that, in that environment of wealth and ostentation, he would become a target of ridicule. Charles, with his deep voice and mocking laugh, had already signaled that he wouldn't mince words if something struck him as ridiculous. It was during the third team's presentation that the first spark of the unexpected emerged. One of the night's most anticipated prototypes, a robot programmed to solve complex calculations in seconds, began to malfunction in front of the audience. The gears jammed, the lights flickered erratically, and the mechanical arms stopped mid-movement, eliciting worried murmurs. The team leader, the son of an influential businessman, broke out in a cold sweat as he tried to restart the system, but nothing worked. The judges looked at each other, ready to record the failure, while Charles chuckled, pleased to see that even the rich sometimes stumble. It was at that moment that Raphael, in the back of the room, couldn't contain himself. His eyes fixed on the robot, and in a firm but barely audible voice, he murmured, "I know what's wrong. I can fix it." The moment Raphael muttered those words, his mother stared at him in astonishment, almost in disbelief. He wasn't just observing as usual. He was convinced he had the solution. Luciana tried to hide it, pressing her son's arm to keep him silent, but the boy wouldn't take his eyes off the broken robot on the stage. To him, the jerky movements, the erratic sound of the motors, and even the way the lights flickered were clear clues to a simple problem that could be solved in a matter of minutes. However, to the engineers present and the proud students, it seemed like a puzzle with no immediate solution. Charles, seated in the front row, was already laughing out loud, shaking his head dismissively and whispering sarcastic comments to the businessman beside him. His every laugh echoed through the auditorium, fueling the competitors' embarrassment and heightening the sense of failure in the air. Raphael, however, didn't seem intimidated. His fingers gripped the notebook he carried tightly, as if that simple object were his source of courage. He'd already drawn a mental diagram of how the robot worked and knew exactly where the error lay, a misconnected wire that was overloading one of the main gears. In his mind, the fix was as obvious as correcting a miscalculation on a chalkboard. The problem was, no one there would trust his word. Who would believe the cleaning lady's son in front of an auditorium full of experts, wealthy parents, and a millionaire ready to ridicule any boldness? Still, Raphael felt his chest burn with the need to prove himself right. There was something greater than fear in that moment, the certainty that if he remained silent, he would forever carry the burden of not having tried. It was then that one of the judges, irritated by the delay, stood up and announced that the team could be disqualified. The student leader began to stammer an explanation, but his trembling hands betrayed his inability to respond. At that moment, Raphael's voice echoed louder, firmer and clearer. "I can prove it." The silence that followed was crushing. All eyes turned to the corner where he stood, as if in disbelief. Luciana held her breath, fearing the worst. Charles slowly turned his head toward the boy and, with a smile full of contempt, said loudly for all to hear, "The maid's son? You think you can do better than them? Well, come and show us." Raphael stood motionless for a few seconds, feeling the weight of all those gazes pierce his body like invisible blades. Never before had he been the center of attention, much less in such a luxurious and hostile environment. Still, something inside him urged him forward. With slow but determined steps, he rose from his seat next to his mother and began walking toward the stage. The sound of his worn sneakers echoed on the polished auditorium floor, contrasting with the shine of the expensive shoes around him. Each step seemed to provoke new muffled laughter and malicious whispers. "He won't make it," someone commented in the background. Charles, with a venomous smile, crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat, as if awaiting a ridiculous spectacle that would end in failure. For him, nothing would be more pleasurable than seeing the son of a maid humiliated in front of everyone. Luciana, from the back of the room, felt her heart racing. Her mother's instincts screamed to run to her son and pull him back, but her legs remained rooted to the spot. There was something different in Raphael's gaze at that moment, a gleam of confidence she couldn't ignore. For the first time, she saw him not as a helpless child, but as someone ready to face the world. The audience, curious, leaned forward in their seats, torn between the desire to see the boy fail and the strange feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. The judges, though incredulous, allowed him to approach the robot, more out of curiosity than faith in his words. After all, if the boy failed, it would just be another joke to punctuate the evening. Raphael climbed the stage steps, took a deep breath, and stopped before the imposing machine that had amazed the audience moments before. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, leaned in to observe the circuits, and felt the tension in the room increase with each second of silence. The nervous team leader looked at him with disdain, as if about to push him out. But before he could say anything, Raphael pointed to the side of the structure and said firmly, "The error is here." The audience murmured in disbelief, and Charles let out a laugh that echoed through the auditorium. However, the judge's eyes widened, realizing that the boy had pointed to the very area the technicians hadn't yet inspected. Raphael reached for a screwdriver from the nearby bench, and absolute silence fell over the room. What he was about to do could change not only the competition, but his entire life. Raphael took a deep breath before beginning. With steady hands, despite the chill creeping up his fingers, he positioned the screwdriver on the side of the robot and began dismantling the protective plate. The metallic clang echoed amid the deathly silence that dominated the auditorium. Each screw removed was accompanied by looks of contempt from some and curiosity from others. Charles, his face etched with a sarcastic smile, whispered venomous phrases to the businessman nearby. "See? He doesn't even know what he's doing." But, to everyone's surprise, Raphael didn't hesitate. His movements were precise, sure, as if he had studied the robot for weeks. Exposing the internal wires and gears, he immediately pointed to a displaced cable that fed power to the main motor. "Here's the problem," he said firmly, surprising even the most experienced judges. The engineers present frowned, watching intently. One of them came over to check and, with a look of astonishment, confirmed that the boy was right. The wire was improperly connected and was causing an overload, crashing the entire system. Murmurs spread through the audience, who were now leaning toward the stage, unable to take their eyes off the scene. The embarrassed team leader couldn't believe that a simple boy had identified in minutes what they hadn't noticed in hours of work. Charles, however, wouldn't shut up. He rose from his chair and, loud enough to echo throughout the auditorium, said, "That's luck. He just pointed out where any idiot could mess with." His words carried venom, but they couldn't dim the gleam in Raphael's eyes, who remained determined. Delicately, the boy reconnected the wire, adjusted the gears, and replaced the protective plate, tightening each screw as if it were the final piece of a puzzle. Then he signaled for the robot to restart. Everyone held their breath. The team leader hesitated, but before the judge's eyes, he pressed the power button. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if the world had stopped. Then, slowly, the robot's lights came back on. The motors hummed softly, and the mechanical arm rose perfectly, performing the movement it had interrupted earlier. The audience erupted in murmurs and subdued applause. Raphael took a step back, his heart racing, but without taking his eyes off the millionaire who had challenged him. Charles, now unsmiling, clenched his fists in anger, as the audience began to realize that the boy had accomplished the impossible. The auditorium erupted in applause, but it wasn't ordinary applause. It was applause filled with surprise, as if each clap were a collective confession that no one had expected it. Teachers and judges stood, exchanging incredulous glances, some smiling discreetly, others still trying to comprehend how an unknown boy had solved in minutes a problem that had left experts speechless. Raphael, his hands still shaking, put the screwdriver back on the workbench and took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. Luciana, at the back of the room, felt tears streaming down her face, unable to contain them. They weren't tears of fear, but of pride. Her son had just broken an invisible barrier that had always separated them from the world of the privileged. And in that moment, all eyes, rich, poor, powerful, or common, were on him. But while most applauded, there was one man who couldn't accept this turn of events. Charles Wentworth rose from his seat as if struck by an invisible blow. His face, previously marked by mockery, now became a mask of irritation and disbelief. "This proves nothing," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the auditorium. Anyone could have made that observation. It was pure luck, nothing more. His nervous laughter contrasted with the silence that followed, as the audience now saw the millionaire for the first time without the cloak of absolute arrogance. One of the judges looked at him firmly and replied sharply, "If it were that simple, why haven't any of us managed it before?" The comment cut through the air like a blade, eliciting murmurs of approval. Charles gritted his teeth but didn't back down. He needed to find a way to regain control of the situation. Then, in a sudden gesture, Charles pointed at Raphael and said defiantly, "If you really understand, prove you can create something on your own. Solving a loose thread doesn't make you a genius." The audience reacted with astonishment, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads in disapproval. The judges looked at each other, and one of them asked Raphael if he had the courage to present something right now. The boy, still clutching his worn notebook to his chest, took a deep breath. His eyes filled with determination, as if this were the chance he'd been waiting for his whole life. "I can prove it," he said again firmly, as he slowly opened the notebook and revealed pages and pages of drawings, diagrams, and meticulous calculations. The audience held their breath. What until then was just scribbled paper could become the definitive proof that would silence Charles's arrogance before everyone. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, as if everyone there had forgotten to breathe. Raphael calmly flipped through his notebook, revealing pages filled with scribbles that, to the untrained eye, might have looked like mere child's drawings. But to those who observed closely, every line was logical, every stroke connected with mathematical precision. They were circuit designs, motor schematics, ideas for improvised robots made from recycled parts. One of the judges, intrigued, asked for a closer look, and upon receiving the notebook, his eyes widened in astonishment. "This is months' work, maybe years," he murmured, quickly turning the pages. The audience murmured curiously, while Charles rolled his eyes and let out a mocking laugh. "Drawings in a notebook? Is that what you call genius? He's just a dreamy kid, nothing more." The millionaire's words echoed, but they no longer carried the same weight as before. Raphael took a deep breath, looked up, and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "I didn't just draw. I built." The revelation fell like a bombshell in the room. Luciana, overcome with emotion, put her hands to her mouth, in disbelief that her son was willing to expose himself even further. The boy explained that, during breaks while helping his mother with schoolwork, he would use discarded materials, snippets of wire, broken motors, old batteries, and secretly create small machines at home. "No one would believe me if I told you this, but now I can show you." He pointed to a worn backpack leaning against the chair where he had been sitting. The audience stirred, the judges exchanged incredulous looks, and even some students, previously smiling, began to show genuine curiosity. Charles, however, shook his head in exasperation. "This is turning into a circus," he grumbled, but his voice no longer drowned out the growing whispers from the audience. With firm steps, Raphael stepped off the stage, picked up his backpack, and returned with it in hand. He placed it on the counter, slowly unzipped it, and removed an object covered in cloth. The suspense was palpable. Each second seemed to drag on for an eternity. When he finally removed the cloth, he revealed a small machine built with improvised parts, bicycle gears, repurposed wires, scrap metal transformed into a living thing. It was a simple but functional robot, moving autonomously and emitting signals from homemade sensors. The audience reacted with murmurs of surprise, and one of the judges leaned in for a closer look, impressed by the ingenuity. Charles, however, took 2 steps forward and pointed his finger at the boy. "That's nothing but an old can with batteries. I bet it doesn't even work." Raphael just smiled confidently, holding up the small makeshift remote. And before anyone could say anything else, he turned on the device. When Raphael flipped the makeshift switch, a soft hum rippled through the auditorium, shattering the tense silence. The small machine, made of scrap metal, came to life before the audience's incredulous eyes. Gears turned precisely, sensors flashed different colors, and within seconds, the robot began moving on its own across the bench. These weren't clumsy or random movements, but planned trajectories that revealed intelligence in its programming. The machine dodged obstacles, made precise turns, and even responded to simple commands from the rudimentary controller Raphael held. Murmurs of astonishment spread through the auditorium, and some jurors stood up to take a closer look, unable to hide their shock. Luciana, her hands trembling, felt her chest swell with pride as tears streamed down her face. In that moment, her son wasn't just the maid's son. He was a creator, an inventor before everyone's eyes. The audience's reaction was divided into 2 extremes. On one side, restrained applause from those who recognized his genius, and on the other, nervous giggles from those who couldn't bear the thought of seeing a humble boy steal the spotlight from wealthy heirs. Charles, overcome with barely concealed rage, took a few steps toward the stage. His red face betrayed the frustration of seeing his mockery dismantled by a machine made of scraps. "This is a cheap trick," he shouted, trying to stifle the wave of admiration rising in the auditorium. But before he could continue, one of the judges snatched the controller from Raphael's hand and tested the robot himself. To everyone's surprise, the little machine responded in kind, dodging objects placed in front of it and executing commands flawlessly. The audience, which had been divided until then, erupted in applause that echoed like thunder. What had previously been doubt now turned into confirmation. The boy had truly proven his talent. Still, Charles was unwilling to accept defeat. His eyes sparkled, and his voice rose higher than ever. "Don't you see? This proves nothing about him. Anyone can gather junk and make a toy if they have the time. That doesn't mean he's smart. It just means he knows how to play with scrap metal." The accusation fell like a bucket of cold water on some of the audience, but not on Raphael. He was unfazed. On the contrary, his eyes fixed on the millionaire with surprising steadfastness for someone only 13. "If it's just a scrap toy, then I want to see you take it apart and rebuild it in front of everyone," he replied in a loud, clear, and sharp voice. The audience gasped in shock at the boy's boldness. Charles, taken aback by his courage, froze for a moment. The public challenge had been issued, and there was no way to back down without further losing his authority. For a moment, the entire auditorium fell silent, as if time had stopped. Raphael's challenge hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Charles, known for never backing down from a provocation, felt his face heat up as the audience awaited his reaction. The millionaire opened his mouth to laugh, but no sound came. His eyes narrowed, and he swallowed hard. Every eye in the audience was now fixed on him, waiting for his response. For someone accustomed to being feared and revered, it was unbearable to feel cornered by a 13-year-old boy. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," he finally said harshly, trying to regain control of the situation. But murmurs began to echo through the audience, revealing the general disbelief. For the first time that night, Charles realized his words no longer carried the same weight. The jurors, intrigued by Raphael's boldness, decided to intervene. One of them, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, stood up and declared loudly, "Mr. Wentworth, the boy didn't ask you to invent something from scratch, only to remake what he did with scrap metal. If it's as simple as you said, then prove it here, in front of everyone." The jurors' reinforced challenge provoked a wave of applause from the audience, which now demanded a concrete answer. Charles glared at Raphael, but he was cornered. To refuse would be to publicly admit he didn't know what he was doing. To accept, however, would be to risk failure in front of hundreds of people. His breathing became heavy, and sweat broke out on his forehead, betraying a nervousness he rarely let show. Luciana, watching from afar, could hardly believe her eyes. Her son, previously invisible, had cornered one of the most powerful men in the city. Charles finally stepped up to the bench, snatched the small robot from the judge's hands, and brusquely disassembled it, throwing parts onto the table as if they were insignificant. His movements were clumsy, driven more by anger than technique, and it soon became clear that he had no idea how to reassemble the circuits correctly. The audience watched attentively, some chuckling quietly, others hoping he would make things even more complicated. Raphael, silent, observed each movement calmly, as if knowing the outcome before it even happened. Within minutes, the millionaire was floundering, mixing up parts, connecting wires in the wrong places, and sweating in despair. "This is ridiculous. These parts are defective," he shouted, trying to justify his failure. But no one seemed to believe him. One of the judges cleared his throat, looked at Raphael, and made the invitation that would change the course of the evening. "Kid, show us how it's done again." Raphael walked to the bench with calm steps, in stark contrast to Charles's nervous agitation. He carefully picked up the scattered pieces, as if they were precious treasures, and arranged them one by one on the spread cloth. As he did so, his mind raced, but his hands moved calmly, conveying confidence. The auditorium, now completely silent, followed each gesture as if witnessing a delicate surgery. The judges, standing, leaned in to observe better, and even the students, previously full of pride and arrogance, looked on with genuine admiration. Raphael held each wire, each screw, and explained in a clear voice, "This isn't about money, it's about logic. Every piece has a function, and when you respect that function, everything works in harmony." Luciana, at the back of the room, wiped away tears, unable to believe that this skinny boy who grew up amid sacrifices was now teaching lessons in front of millionaires and experts. As Raphael reassembled the machine, Charles squirmed in his chair, unable to bear the scene. His pride, always unshakable, was being destroyed before everyone's eyes, not by a powerful rival, but by someone he considered insignificant. With each piece the boy fitted together, the millionaire's humiliation grew heavier. Some businessmen whispered among themselves, clearly impressed, and even recorded the moment on their cell phones, as if witnessing something historic. Raphael, for his part, seemed unconcerned about the audience. He was immersed in his task, focused solely on doing what he loved, bringing life to what seemed useless. And precisely this contrast, genuine passion versus empty arrogance, captivated every eye and heart in that auditorium. After a few minutes of work, Raphael made the final adjustments and turned the device back on. The little robot flashed its lights and began to move with impeccable precision, even better than before. The audience burst into applause, now much more intense, as if celebrating a collective victory against Charles's arrogance. The judges applauded, standing, and even some of the more conservative professors rose to acknowledge the feat. Charles, red with rage, stood abruptly and shouted, "This proves nothing. He just memorized what he did before. It's just repeated luck." But his voice was no longer strong. It was drowned out by the vibration of the applause and the growing conviction among everyone. The maid's son had won the challenge. Raphael looked directly at the millionaire, and in his gaze there was something that words could not convey. The courage of someone who knows he hasn't shown everything yet. Applause still echoed when Charles, unable to accept defeat, stood up abruptly, his face filled with barely contained fury. His eyes flashed with rage, and his voice, deep and full of venom, pierced the auditorium. You're all being fooled." He memorized these moves and just repeated what he'd already done. That doesn't make him a genius, just a cheap trickster. The audience reacted with boos and murmurs of disapproval, but Charles didn't back down. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept that his authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. He walked to the center of the stage and, before the judges, issued a new challenge. If he's so clever, let him show something completely new, something he's never prepared before. Only then will we see if he really is what they pretend to believe. The audience fell silent, intrigued by the provocation, while Raphael remained motionless, tightly gripping the control of his robot. The judges looked at each other, divided. Some thought the request was excessive, a clear sign of Charles's desperation. Others, however, saw it as a unique opportunity to truly test the boy's limits. Luciana, her heart racing, feared for her son, but when she looked at Raphael, she noticed there was no room for hesitation in his eyes. He stood firm, breathing deeply, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Okay," he said clearly, looking directly at Charles. "If you want something new, I can prove it." His unexpected courage drew gasps from the audience and forced even the judges to turn their full attention to him. Charles arched an eyebrow, surprised by the boldness, but maintained his mocking smile. For him, it was impossible that the maid's son would be able to improvise something in front of so many experts. It was the perfect opportunity to crush the boy's confidence once and for all. Raphael then opened his backpack again, pulling out a small makeshift kit made of loose wires, batteries, and recycled parts. The audience reacted in amazement, as it was impossible to believe that something actually functional could come out of such a pile of scrap. The boy placed everything on the table, then quickly flipped through his notebook, pointing to a still unfinished diagram. "I was working on this, but never finished it. If you'll let me, I can put it together right here." The eager judges nodded, eager to see how far he could go. Charles let out a loud laugh, echoing through the auditorium. "This is going to be fun. I want to see you sink in front of everyone." But Raphael was unfazed. His hands were already at work, connecting pieces skillfully and quickly. Silence fell over the room. Everyone knew they were about to witness something that could change the course of that night once and for all. Raphael began to work with a calmness that contrasted with the tension gripping the auditorium. His small, agile hands moved with impressive precision, connecting wires, adjusting gears, and fitting recycled pieces together like perfect puzzle blocks. The audience watched in absolute silence, hearing only the metallic click of the pieces coming together. It was hard to believe that a 13-year-old boy, without sophisticated laboratories or modern tools, could improvise in front of everyone, creating something new from scratch. Charles, arms crossed, tried to maintain his arrogant smile, but his expression hardened with each firm step the boy took. Murmurs grew in the back of the audience, some betting Raphael could do it, others saying it would be impossible. For everyone, this was no longer just a technical demonstration, but a spectacle charged with emotion and challenge. While time seemed to pass faster for the anxious spectators, Raphael remained serene, as if he were alone in his room, assembling a machine for fun. At times, he quietly explained what he was doing. "Here, the circuit needs balance. This gear distributes the force, and this improvised sensor helps detect obstacles." Each explanation heightened the curiosity of the judges, who now leaned in to observe every detail. Luciana, pressing her hands against her chest, felt pride and fear mingling within her. Her heart felt like it was about to burst, but her confidence in her son grew with each passing second. Charles, on the other hand, could no longer hide his unease. The millionaire ran his hand through his hair, shifted constantly in his chair, and whispered nervous phrases to the businessmen nearby, but no one paid him any attention. Everyone was mesmerized by the boy's spectacle. Finally, after a few minutes of intense work, Raphael erected the improvised prototype. It wasn't a large or flashy machine, but there was a gleam of ingenuity in every detail. A small, recycled metal structure equipped with improvised sensors he had adapted himself. With a simple movement, he connected 2 batteries and turned on the system. The object vibrated, emitted a low sound, and began moving slowly across the table, circling makeshift obstacles the judges had placed in front of it. The audience reacted with a collective murmur of surprise. One of the more experienced professors, open-mouthed, murmured, This wasn't planned. He created it right here, in front of us." The tension rose like a wave about to burst, and everyone held their breath. Charles, standing trembling, was about to lose control. The auditorium erupted in thunderous applause as the improvised prototype began to work. It was impossible to deny Raphael's talent. Not only had he repaired a high-tech robot minutes earlier, but now he had created a new machine from scratch in front of everyone, under pressure and with limited resources. Teachers rose, some clapping, while judges exchanged astonished looks, recognizing the boy's rare genius. Students who had laughed at him minutes before now watched in awe, as if they had witnessed something they would never forget. Luciana, unable to contain her emotion, brought her hands to her face, letting the tears fall freely. For her, this was more than a victory. It was proof that her son didn't need wealth to shine. Charles, however, remained standing, paralyzed, his face red with rage, unable to accept what his eyes were seeing. "This is impossible," the millionaire shouted, trying to drown out the applause. "Don't you realize? He must have set this up beforehand. Someone must have helped him." But his voice no longer held the same authority as before. Each word sounded like a desperate lament, and the audience reacted with boos and protests. One of the judges, irritated, responded firmly, "Nobody helped this kid. We saw it with our own eyes. He set it up in front of everyone, piece by piece." The statement was met with even louder applause, which echoed through the auditorium like a unanimous chorus against Charles's arrogance. The millionaire, who had always been accustomed to controlling any situation, now found himself reduced to a desperate man, without arguments, without credibility, without respect. The respectful silence that had previously surrounded him had vanished, replaced by looks of judgment and disapproval. Charles, overcome with shame and fury, pointed his finger at Raphael and, with a trembling voice, said, "You may have fooled everyone here, but you'll never be more than a maid's son. You'll never have my respect." The words, cruel and laced with venom, rang through the auditorium and made the audience gasp in shock. Luciana felt her chest tighten, but before she could react, Raphael stepped forward and looked up, his gaze firm as ever. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet courage and confidence that seemed beyond his years. The auditorium, in anticipation, fell silent again. It was as if everyone knew something important was about to be said, something that could crush the millionaire's arrogance once and for all and seal the fate of the evening. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, as if each of Charles's words had struck them like a low blow. Some spectators looked at each other in disbelief, unable to believe the millionaire had descended to such a level of cruelty. Others shook their heads in disapproval, murmuring indignant comments. Raphael, however, was unfazed. The boy took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and faced Charles directly, fearlessly. His voice rang out clear and firm, "I don't need your respect. True respect can't be bought with money or power. It's earned with truth and courage." The audience reacted with a collective murmur, as if each word had struck home the wound the millionaire was trying to hide. Luciana, overcome with emotion, wiped away her tears, realizing that in that moment her son was speaking not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever been slighted in life. The impact of Raphael's response reverberated through the auditorium like an unstoppable wave. Many began to applaud, while the judges, visibly touched, nodded silently, recognizing not only the boy's technical talent, but also his maturity and inner strength. Charles, feeling cornered, tried to laugh, but his laughter sounded false, nervous, and out of sync. Each attempt to regain control only plunged him deeper into humiliation. Raphael, in turn, stepped forward, approaching the edge of the stage, and lifted the small, improvised robot in his hands. "This isn't just a machine made of scrap metal," he said. "It's proof that no one should be judged by where they come from. Talent can be born anywhere, even where you least expect it." His words echoed like a definitive sentence, charged with a truth that could not be disputed. The audience, now completely won over, burst into deafening applause, rising as one voice in support of the boy. Some students shouted Raphael's name. Others raised their cell phones to record this historic moment. Charles, red with anger and shame, seemed to shrink before the boy's unexpected greatness. Luciana, unable to hold back her tears, smiled with pride and emotion, feeling that every sacrifice she had made in life had finally paid off. Yet, the silence that followed carried a different tension. One of the city's most respected judges, known for his coolness and impartiality, asked to speak. The audience immediately fell silent, awaiting what he had to say. His serious gaze swept the auditorium and landed on Raphael. "Boy," he said gravely, "your words and actions have impressed everyone, but I want to know if you are prepared for the consequences." The judge, known for his rigidity and never giving in to sentimentality, slowly rose and walked to the center of the stage. His footsteps echoed through the auditorium in absolute silence, the anticipation mounting with each passing second. When he finally stopped in front of Raphael, he looked the boy up and down, as if weighing every detail before speaking. "Understand, boy," he said firmly, "showing talent is one thing. Taking responsibility for it is another. Today you not only fixed a machine, but you also exposed one of the most influential men in this city. This will have consequences." The audience's murmur grew again, charged with tension. Luciana clasped her hands tightly, her heart racing, unsure if this was the recognition she expected or a disguised rebuke. Raphael, however, stood his ground, taking a deep breath and looking the judge in the eye. The silence that followed was broken by a rare smile on the judge's face. "But if there's one thing this entire auditorium has witnessed," he continued, "it's that true knowledge doesn't depend on titles, wealth, or social standing. You've proven to us that genius can emerge anywhere." The audience responded with spontaneous applause, and some even stood again, unable to contain their excitement. The judge raised his hand for silence, and then made the announcement that would change the course of the evening. "On behalf of the board of this institution, we offer you, Raphael, a full scholarship. We want your talent to be honed here, at this school, with all the resources that were previously denied to you." The words echoed like thunder, eliciting deafening applause and tears of joy from Luciana. Raphael, overcome with emotion, put his hand to his mouth in disbelief. Charles, for his part, seemed increasingly slumped in his chair. The man who had always been a symbol of power and arrogance was now nothing more than a defeated spectator. His eyes roamed the auditorium, searching for support that no longer existed. The businessmen who used to flatter him now avoided him, turning their full attention to the boy who had stolen the show. Anger consumed every fiber of his being, but he knew that any word would be just another step towards his public ruin. Raphael, with discreet tears in his eyes, looked at his mother, who smiled proudly, and then at the audience that applauded him relentlessly. Still, a different weight hung in the air. The judge, in a more serious tone, added, "But remember, Raphael, this is just the beginning. The road ahead will be hard, and many will try to bring you down." The audience fell silent, awaiting the boy's reaction. Raphael's heart was pounding, but his eyes shone with an indelible confidence. He gripped the battered notebook tightly in his hands, raised it before the audience, and said in a clear voice, "This is my beginning. Everything I've done so far has been with scraps and improvisation. Imagine what I can build when I have access to true knowledge, to the right tools. I will show that talent has no owner, no last name, no price. And no one, not even a millionaire, can erase the truth." The audience burst into thunderous applause, rising as one voice. Teachers wept, students clapped until their hands turned red, and Luciana, overcome with emotion, couldn't stop smiling. In that moment, Raphael was no longer just the maid's son. He was the boy who had silenced arrogance with courage and wisdom. Charles, hunched in his chair, seemed smaller than ever. His eyes, once filled with pride, now reflected only defeat and shame. He tried to get up and leave discreetly, but the audience wouldn't let him go unnoticed. Every disapproving look, every gesture of indifference crushed him more than any words could. The businessmen who used to fawn over him turned their faces away, refusing to greet him. What had once been a stage for his greatness had become a silent tribunal condemning him. As he walked toward the exit, his once imposing image now showed nothing more than a defeated man, unable to face the truth he had tried to deny until the last second. On stage, Raphael turned to the judges and humbly bowed. There was no vanity in his gesture, only gratitude. He then turned to his mother, who walked toward him with tears in her eyes, and embraced her in front of everyone. The entire auditorium applauded relentlessly, and some shouted the boy's name, transforming his victory into a symbol greater than any award. It was the victory of truth over lies, courage over fear, humility over arrogance. In that moment, Raphael not only won a scholarship, he earned the right to dream without limits. The maid's son had proven, before everyone, that true greatness is not measured by money, but by the courage to stand up and say, "I can prove it." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.